Let's see if it starts with quick. Oh, hello there. I'm your host, Anderson Todd, author, lecturer, dreamweaver, and welcome to the penultimate lecture of NEW302, the full year-long course. Welcome back. I do apologize. I am a techno peasant, apparently, and have had a tremendous amount of problem in the past week with video processing in multiple domains. But man, I've had some doozies with this. I went to record a lecture. Yesterday, and at one point there was a noise, like a cell phone went off, because I'm at home. And so a ringtone went off, and so I paused it, hit the pause button, but inadvertently hit it twice. And so what you then get is like 10 seconds of me kind of like making a face and pawing through a book, and then I hit it again to record the rest of the lecture, except then I had put it on pause. The fact that I discovered after I delivered the whole lecture. So I'm compulsively looking at this thing to make sure that it's actually recording me. So yeah. Okay, so what's today? Well, today, if you have looked at e-syllabus, today is Alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone, the Self. Now, I said that we'd be having a guest lecturer. Hooray, my guest lecturer is me, apparently, unless I decide to cut in footage, which I suppose I could do, or post links. But really specifically, it's readings to be determined, because this is intended to be something of a summative. There is a bit of a logistical point, and I'll get to that in a second, but it is something of a summative thing. You know, when we're talking about the great work, and I'll probably post this thing up in chunks just to make it a bit more tractable than a 3-hour-long blast. Also, I'm going live at 6 p.m. So I'm going live at 6 p.m. and you can interact with me for a while then. Depending on the processing speed, it may be up a little late. So you may actually have to watch the lecture as a whole tomorrow. So maybe I'll put it up in chunks, put this first bit up first, and then put the other chunks, and maybe I'll even label them appropriately. We'll see what happens. So that's what we're talking about. Tonight we're going to be talking about Alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone. But there are a few logistical pieces first. One, next week's class, generally speaking, what I do is an experiential exercise at the end of the course. Okay, so there's like this alchemical exercise. Now I'm hoping that we can do it live next week, but it's hard to create the sense of shared space and communitas when we don't have shared space. Now, luckily we do, in fact, have communitas, right? We have a shared sense, and that's extremely important to me. It's one of the things that I really experienced when I took this course many years ago. And it's something that I think is extremely important to foster in the course. It's one of the reasons that I encourage people and continue to encourage people to interact with the Jungian Society. And it's part of the reason why I encourage people to go out together after class and to socialize and to talk about this stuff otherwise, is that I want to create that sense. It seems to me that with full year courses, very often there's this thing where at first people are, you maybe know a couple of people in the class or whatever, but things are a little standoffish, they're a little formal, they're a little quiet. You might get the one person who's very vocal, but there isn't that much sharing going on, right? And the comfort level rises, and people start to share material about themselves and each other. Like, it starts to become that kind of thing. And just when that stuff hits a peak, class is over, right? Class is over. And that's always a little bit, like it's a little bit of a drop. Now, that said, okay, out of my having taken this course years ago, I then joined the Jungian Society, and I did a year in the role of secretary, and then I was president for a number of years, and then co-president and whatever. Like, that was quite important. And a bunch of my friends, my long-term friends, my best friends in university, were people that I met in the course, because we had this accelerated sharing of the material. So I encourage people to continue on in that respect. I'm hoping people do, in fact, show up to this thing at 6, and I'm hoping that that people will show up tomorrow and that we can have some roundtable conversation. But there's a second part to that, okay? Now, obviously, right, it's like when you lose something, it's always the last place you look. Well, yes, of course it is, because you found it there. Like, by definition, that's the last place you look. If you keep looking, right, that's the joke. And it's kind of the same with the peak of of integration within classroom culture and a group, right? Yeah, of course, it's like it hits a peak and then it's over because it's over, and that's why that's in some ways the peak. But I like to ceremonially mark it a bit. This is a tradition that I inherited from the instructor that I took the course with originally, Bruce, and it's remained a consistent feature of the course. I have in fact generalized it. I do an outing twice a year. So normally I take people out and buy you guys a bunch of wine, purchase some wine off the university's books, and some food and stuff, and we have an opportunity to socialize. And that's something I really look forward to. And I think lots of people in the class look forward to it too. And unfortunately, we can't do that. But here's what I'm going to suggest. And people can send me their feedback and we can discuss it tonight. We can discuss it tomorrow in office hours. Let's like do the equivalent. Let's have a virtual pub night. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that, like, I don't know, none of these software platforms do an especially good job of processing simultaneity in that sense. I know because I've been playing more than my fair share of online role-playing games since it started as one of the ways of maintaining, network. I mean, I always have some dice with me. That's just common sense. But also, right, we have noticed that there are some technical limitations there. So I don't know how well that's going to work, but it would be really cool if next week after class, okay, people could stick around and we could have a few drinks, shoot the shit. I can give you guys a tour of my library, which I can't normally do. So I can take you up and down. You can see one wall here. What do we got? Oh, there's the sequel, Fifth Business, and then the Manticore in the middle. World of Wonders is the third. We got Delta Green. We got some consciousness theory. That's good stuff. What else? So there's what's that guy's name? It's gonna bug me. Wilber, Ken Wilber. Ken Wilber has a really good critique of Jung, actually. Ken Wilber's critique of Jung is that Jung's theory of the unconscious fails to distinguish higher and lower consciousness, right? That there can be, right? That it kind of muddles that stuff together. That's a good critique. A lot of Wilber, I find it's a bit hard to track, but I think that's a really interesting critique. What else have we got? Oh, collapse. It's creepily topical, and we'll get to that. What else? What do we got? Structure of Magic. Not actually about magic. It's about hypnosis. That's Bandler and Grinder. Age of Empathy. Obviously very important. There's some biblical studies. What else? That looks like Hamlet. Obviously topical. What do we got? The Attention Merchants up there. That's about Giordano Bruno. You can't really read it. There's Eric Fromm's The Forgotten Language. That's an excellent book. What do we get? Oh, It. That's just amazing. Scary Clowns. Shakespeare. The Decameron. The Decameron is weirdly topical right now. The Decameron, of course, is a story of a bunch of people who, essentially speaking, are, right? It's like the Canterbury Tales a little, or like 1001 Nights, right? 1001 Arabian Nights is like, well, you're stuck inside, and so it's a series of stories. But with the Decameron specifically, they're stuck inside because of a plague. Not to get too on point, right? But anyway, and so storytelling, and this role of collective storytelling has been big. Maybe we'll do some storytelling next week. That might be fun. Okay, so you can see that there's sort of all these different things in my library. And did I give you guys I'll give you the sweeping tour. Okay, this is the sweeping tour. So nope. What? Don't puke. Okay, there, and up to the ceiling there, and over, and down. And you can see my canned goods, and there, and there, and there, and there. Basically, the whole apartment's full of books. It's like 1,200 square feet of books. And how else would you want it, honestly? That's why I keep talking to people on these things, and they're like, oh, you have like a little thing built in your library. I'm like, no, that's just my wall. It says all my walls look like that. Anyway, I can take you guys on a bit of a tour and we can talk. So let's try to organize sort of a virtual outing. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I know that some friends of mine have done these virtual pub nights. I haven't. I've stuck to some virtual D&D with a few Gin Caesars. But let's see if we can get one of these virtual pub nights kind of going, because I really appreciate that. And then we'll celebrate it when we actually get released back into the world, when we are finally not like a bunch of caged tigers pacing the confines of our environment, when we have spent the inward time and are finally released into the world again. Let's meet up, break bread, have drinks. Maybe it'll be in the summer. We'll see what happens. Okay. So I want to do that, but in the meantime, let's do it virtually. So that will be next week, like after class, basically. I'll do class in the evening and then we'll fire it up, and I don't care. Let's keep it going. So I'm not likely to bother my neighbors because I'm at home and it's not terribly loud. So that's kind of my idea. I hope everybody can make it. It's a traditional thing that I like to do. I unfortunately can't really buy you drinks, so you're going to have to go BYOB. I hope you're stocked up before, before. I believe that's still considered an essential service because the government knows how to keep people from not being stir crazy, and so keeping marijuana and alcohol available is probably part of that. And electronics all got designated essential services. So don't go out unless you have to. This should be obvious to you by now, but hopefully you've got some supplies on hand. And remember, kids, gin is not an effective disinfectant. Or is it? Is it 70% alcohol? I don't know, really high proof something. Everclear, don't drink that. Anyway, I'm not being an advocate for drinking. I just would like to socialize with you. So that's a bit of logistics for next week. Okay. Something else I want to say, because I talked about this a little bit in the lead up. The archetype of the apocalypse has been strongly constellated for people. Now, I want to repeat, I don't think this is the apocalypse. But the fact is that archetype is really active in the collective right now, right? And people are making jokes about it a lot, right? And they're still kind of jokey, but you'll see it, right? The memes are flying. Social media is just full of this apocalyptic narrative stuff, right? Because, right? And you can look at that, right? REM hit the charts again with The End of the World as We Know It, right? An older song. And it's a good song. Don't get me wrong. I've had it stuck in my head, The End of the World as We Know It. There are other things you could listen to in that vein. I was listening to, if anybody likes the band, MGMT, which some people still refer to as Management, but it is MGMT, had an album out in 2008, so around the time of the financial crisis, right, called Oracular Spectacular. There's a track on there called Weekend Wars. It's this very sort of apocalyptic track. It's great. It's very sort of Bowie-inspired in its way, but the whole album is terrific. I've been really listening to that, so I highly recommend that. Diamond Dogs by David Bowie, also a terrific sort of apocalyptic-y kind of thing that is nevertheless full of terrific breakaway pop hits, and it's very danceable. Highly recommend that. If you're going to listen to Bowie, you might as well listen to Station to Station, because Station to Station, just the album is awesome, but that track is, of course, about Kabbalistic Western magic. That's even the title, Station to Station, is a reference of navigating the tree of life in the Kabbalistic system. This is all top of the stack because I was just talking about it for another lecture. But anywho, the archetype of the apocalypse is strongly constellated. Now, I have been searching my somewhat disorganized library in vain to attempt to find Edinger's book on this, because Edinger has a book on this called The Archetype of the Apocalypse. And I've been looking on it partly because I want to read the damn thing again and see what this brings up for me, right? Whether or not it brings sort of useful material up and what it has to say. And I spoke with a colleague of mine who is a Jungian analyst, and he, in fact, said, oh yeah, it's got some really great stuff. So I've been looking for my copy. I cannot find it. So I finally just broke down and ordered another one in hard copy. But meanwhile, I've dug up every other piece of Edinger I have in an effort to pull some of this together. And I think that we would be remiss, okay, to the present circumstances, if we did not take some opportunity to address that, in addition to addressing, right, the great work, the Philosopher's Stone, Alchemy, and the Self, right? Because this is a big deal, right? It's a big deal. Even if you had some sense that, like, and I think many people have, right, with the mounting absurdity of the last bunch of years, right, this idea is like, wow, things are hyper real. You get people talk about the darkest timeline, right, this kind of joke, or like, oh my God, the simulation, right, the simulation is cueing us. And, I've said before, I think the simulation hypothesis, I don't think we're actually living in a simulation, but it's an interesting hypothesis. But I think that if the Matrix was cueing us, the best way that it would cue us is, in a way, by turning up the absurdity dial. The same way that, like, that's what you look out for in a dream when you try to become lucid in the dream, like, wake up, wake up, wake up, right? And I used to joke, of course, at the moment that I was like, come on, like, the simulation is just hitting us across the face, was when there was a reality show that starred Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg. And I was like, that's not a thing. And there's an actual, like, gold hoarding dragon living in the White House, an orange gold hoarding dragon. That's just like too weird, right? So there's been this mounting absurdity, and against that, there's been the background of crisis. We talked about it right before the break. We talked about it right before lockdown. Uh, you know, and we talked about, you know, the extent to which there's the idea this can't go on. Not just because it's absurd, but because it's like, can this go on? Like, you look around and you're like, this can't go on. This can't go on. You can't have infinite growth in a finite system, which is what our economic system is predicated on, right? So this is a thing I used to say a lot when I talked about Edward Bernays, right? And I talked about the foundation of modern consumerist capitalist culture and so on and so forth. And one of the things is like, look, the system has to maintain this perpetual state of consumption. It has to. If growth drops below 2%, economists start to clench up, right? If growth drops below 2%, but growth by percentage is necessarily, right, geometric in its progression. It's exponential, right? It's not strictly additive, right? That's how compound interest works. And Einstein is on record famously as saying compound interest was the most powerful force in the universe. Well, many of you will have heard the story, right? The classic story about the peasant who performs a task for the emperor, and so the emperor's like, give me any reward, you know, just name it. And so the peasant's like, okay, so take a chessboard, 64 squares, and on the first square put 1 grain of rice, and on the second square put 2 grains of rice, and on the third square put 4 grains of rice. And on the fourth square put 8 grains of rice. And the emperor at this point is like, yeah, okay, rice, what's the problem? Except, like, sit down and do that with a calculator. And what you find is, with doubling, those numbers get big fast. Exponential doubling, incidentally, as I mentioned, ought to be on your radar because that is the operative principle of contagion, which is one of the reasons why it violates our intuitions. These numbers, they get, you know, like suddenly, then all at once, right? Big. If you don't do things to sort of suppress that system. Apparently we've switched from flatten the curve to plank the curve. I don't know if that was Trudeau's innovation. I did kind of laugh. It's very active and athletic sounding. We're going to plank the curve, and it turns it into a challenge, right? You know, people planking things. So that's great. I guess if we can turn this into a social challenge, that will be effective. But the point is that exponential power, right, is sort of unexpected in that important sense. So it's exponential in that important sense. So compound interest, right? It's that same kind of exponential thing. And so when you get the grains of rice, you start multiplying that up, boom, fine. Now with the economy, the idea is it has to grow at 2%, and if it shrinks under 2%, we can't service the interest on loans, and post Bretton Woods 2 and the removal from the gold standard, all money is sort of loaned into existence. This is not an economics course, so that's not that important. But the point is, how do you have infinite growth in a finite system? And that's what the Earth is. It's a finite system. Now, there are certain features of it that allow you to get outside that finitude, right? That it isn't a zero-sum game. So cooperation is non-zero sum, right? Altruism is non-zero sum. There are non-zero-sum sort of things that occur, right? Culture is importantly non-zero sum, right? A group of people together can do more than those people could as individuals. And most of our collective actions involve that in some way, right? You can't, no one person can run an airline, right? An airline, it requires collective action. Science is a collective action, and the academy generally is collective. One of the reasons why I always emphasize, stop focusing so much on perfection in your work. The academy is here for you to bring imperfect things and collectivize them, to spread them, to talk about them. Because an imperfect thing that is interesting is more useful in that environment than a perfect thing that's boring, right? And that's an important thing to remember in your work. Give people toys to play with, right? If you give them an interesting problem and it connects with their thing, then you can get contributions. That's how this is supposed to work. Okay, so collective. Now, you can get outside the zero-sum game in that way to some extent, but the point is, when we're talking about resources on the planet is finite, right? There aren't new continents to explore. You know, we've been talking about colonizing the seafloor since the 60s, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. Our efforts at creating secondary, biodome experiments and that kinds of things have not gone well. So I would not put too much faith yet in the idea that we're going to set up permanent colonies on the moon and Mars. I'm not saying those things are impossible. I doubt very much they're impossible. I think they're possible, but we don't have the capacity yet. And the kinds of artificial systems that we create tend to be shallow systems. Natural organic systems are complicated. They have complicated systems of regulation and systems of reinforcement and, right, these sort of loops in them. So in that sense, the Earth is complex but finite, with complex but finite resources. And nevertheless, our economy makes the assumption of infinite growth. Well, you can't have infinite growth in a finite system. And if it's not just a desire to have infinite growth at 2%, but a requirement, like we drop below 2% growth and everybody, right? Where's that leave us? Well, it leaves us right now. So we can't go on. Why? Like, that's why everybody's locking up. This frees up in the economy. And the fact right now that in the States, okay, particularly, and the States is now poised, unfortunately, to become the global epicenter of this thing. Canada hasn't in some ways moved as fast as they could, but they've done a pretty good job. The prime minister has been, in some ways remarkably prime ministerial. The mayor of the city, Doug Ford, who hasn't always had the most pro-social policies in the world, hasn't always been the most sort of, in my opinion, the most sensible individual in the world, has clearly just like listened to the experts and locked in on this, right? Could they be doing more? Yeah, they could be, but they've done a pretty good job. There's a clear recognition about what's required in terms of social distancing and yada, yada, yada. But the states apparently doesn't want to play that game. Or many of the actual states and governors and people do, but there's calculation going on right now. That's what the president is talking about. And what he's talking about is like, okay, he makes the justified point, right? Like the death toll of this thing is going to be X, depending on how many people catch it and whether or not healthcare is swamped. And I'm sorry if I'm activating this for you. I know that this is like a fire hose of information that's passing through all the time. And if you're reading the news, try to limit how much you're reading the news. But follow me on this for a minute. So the argument is, of course, if the economy utterly implodes, okay, how many people are hurt by that? Right? How many people are emotionally devastated? How many people see serious hunger? How many lives does that screw up? And so it isn't just a question of the death toll of the virus versus the economy. Like you can't just kill the economy in order to whatever, like there's a toll either way. And that's valid, right? But the economy is notional and lives aren't. The economy is made up. And if we agree to something, then it's real. That's part of the point. Right? The value of fiat currency is exactly that. Money is just a construct that we agree on. Now that's in some ways a sophomoric observation, right? That's the kind of thing that, any high schooler smoking pot might hit on, like, money's just paper, man. It's like, yeah, that's true. And it's paper that we all agree to take as value. And lots of things have that quality, right? Really, at the end of the day, what has real value? It isn't gold, despite what gold bugs say, and despite what the alchemists thought, apparently, right? It isn't gold. Like, what really has value? What has real utility? Food has real utility. Shelter has real utility. Human relationships have real utility. Knowledge and wisdom have real utility. Those things are real. And yet we tend to think the opposite. We tend to think that money is important and things like, right, inner material. But you can carry wisdom with you wherever you go. One of the great things about having, racked up a big debt, for instance, as many people, including probably many of us, have done in the pursuit of knowledge, is that they can hit you for the money. You might have to go bankrupt or whatever, but they can't repossess what you've got. Once you've done the work, you've transformed yourself. They can't repossess transformation. Not yet. They can't repossess transformation. But okay, so the point is it's notional, right? We all agree on fiat currency. That's the nature of fiat currency. We agree to treat it as money. It's not even backed by anything. It used to be that you had to have X amount of gold and that could determine your currency, but that's not the case anymore. Now it's just an assigned value. It's a thing that we collectively agree on. If we collectively agreed upon it, we could do all kinds of things, right? Finland is basically putting its entire economy in the freezer. The government is going to cover the salaries of workers, so the workers don't have to be fired. So because the workers don't have to be fired, the companies, right, but don't have to pay the bills, so the companies can maintain, and then basically you suppress everything, you run up a debt, but who the hell cares? And then everybody discharges and your economy hasn't imploded. Not a bad system. We could declare, for instance, a jubilee. That's the thing that used to happen, right? Prior to the modern period, right? Usury used to be a sin. Usury is the practice of charging interest on a debt. Interest used to be considered a sin in the Western world. You weren't allowed to charge interest. It's still considered a sin in parts of the world, right? So under Sharia law, interest, usury, is still a sin. I used to do research for a data mining company, and I learned a ton about Sharia banking. And Sharia banking has to find ways. How do you form investments if you can't charge interest? And you could do things, of course, like be a landlord, right? So you have an investment, but it generates ongoing income, perhaps above what you put into it, because you use it in a way that's productive. And that can get around the rules. But Sharia banking necessarily has to avoid interest generation because that's usury and it was considered a sin. It used to be the case that in the Western world, every 7 years was a jubilee. Right? That was sort of the Jewish law, and that every 7 years was a jubilee. And so that meant that you could collect debts for 6 years, but on the 7th year, debts were all canceled. Just canceled. They had 7 years to get the money out of you, and then after that, it was gone. It didn't exist anymore. It was an automatic reset that everybody sort of accepted, right? That theoretically could be a thing. Debts can be canceled. Debts can be forgiven. The government can pay debt by borrowing money that's made up money anyway. There's a lot of things potentially that we could do. Now, it's a complicated system. Not everybody might agree. There are problems that potentially come with that. You can't just create money out of nowhere necessarily. That's what happened to the Weimar Republic, right? That's how hyperinflation sets in. You start printing money. And if people don't sort of believe enough in your money to let you do that, then all of a sudden your money drops value. Right, that's hyperinflation. That's right. So that's how you get like a wheelbarrow full of Reichsmark being rolled up for a loaf of bread, or in Zimbabwe where their hyperinflation spiked, and they had to print like $1 billion bills and stuff, right? Because the currency devaluated. But the point is, right, that, yeah, there are consequences, but nevertheless, right, collective action against a notional thing, and we can alter this in all kinds of ways. And we probably draw the resources of the planet down faster than we can afford anyhow, right? We probably do it anyhow. And so we need to rethink this. And who knows, maybe we will. Maybe we're about to find out that most of us can do our damn jobs at home. Maybe, right? Maybe we're about to find out that a lot of, right, like what we thought required commerce in the world doesn't. And therefore, hey, wait a minute, like, right, isn't that what the promise of the internet was supposed to be in some ways anyway? Maybe we're about to find that out. Although I worry, of course, about other aspects of this. Like I worry that, the provincial government in Ontario has made this push towards mandatory online courses. And I got to admit, I'm doing this because I have to, but I don't think it's as good as a classroom environment. I don't think it's the same. I don't. And I think the massive courses, you're in a course with 1,000 other people watching a lecture with a PowerPoint, I don't think that makes for good pedagogy. And I don't think it makes for good connections between students and teachers. I don't think it creates good feedback. So we may see a skew in that direction. Anyway, economics, I got to stick to my point. So my point is this. These things are notional. The economy is notional. The Dow Jones is notional. They're all notional, right? And we can tweak those things around, and that doesn't mean that there's going to be pain. But on the other side of that is death. Death. We're talking about death. So, not to single out anybody in particular, but when leaders start saying we can't afford to have things shuttered, we need to get the economy rolling. When other leaders are saying, like, I don't think any grandparent in the country would want, right, their grandkids, the economy that we've built here to be sacrificed. An economy that has, I add, a tremendous disparity between the richest and the poorest, where the possibility of upward mobility is exceptionally, historically low, right? There's more gap between the richest and poorest than there was during the height of the Roman Empire, more than there was during the French Revolution, right? I don't know how much Jeff Bezos made since I've been talking, but it's a lot. And in the present circumstance, I would imagine still more, since I think we've shifted most of our economy into Amazon now, right? Although I saw a thing the other day, it was like a Scooby-Doo meme that was like, let's see who's behind this COVID virus, and Fred pulls the mask off, and what's underneath? Zoom, on which we are presently speaking. I am presently recording and will be speaking with you shortly, right? So clearly there are some people profiting, but the point is this, right? Like, these things where it's like, I don't think anybody would want no grandparent would want da. But what we're really talking about here is death. Like, let's really get that through our head. Like, even if, let's say, hospitals just aren't totally overwhelmed in the States. Sorry, I'm getting political here, but these are the times. So take it or leave it. Let's say that there's a 1% death rate, and that's preposterously low given everything that we know about the science, if it's just sort of left to spread. He's talking about, people are talking about packing churches on Easter, right? Which already is like a nightmare transmission scenario for something that's asymptomatic. Like, we're talking about a serious thing where we're talking about millions of people, and that's at 1%. This is the calculation that we're going through. So in some ways, okay, addressing this with an apocalyptic framework is not entirely wrong. It is probably, in some ways, the end of the world as we know it. But is it like it's a discontinuity, and that's why it's violating our expectations, and it's why it's stirring up all this material for us? And that's something that we need to talk about, the archetype of the apocalypse, and I'm going to, okay? Because the apocalypse is also revelations. It's a revelation. It's revelatory, right? How many articles have now come out that are like, oh yeah, every country's response to the pandemic has been really revealing of its national character. So pressure is revealing of character. Okay. And pressure collectively is revealing of collective character, right? And where collective character is badly fractured and lacking in empathy, we're beginning to see, things roll out in a calculation that's frankly chilling. And, there's an old expression, never more true than now, which is, when the US sneezes, Canada catches a cold. We used to talk about that with minor economic downturns there, and we are looking at an economic downturn, make no mistake. But in this case, that's especially telling, right? It's especially telling because we can take a lot of preventative actions here, but you're about to see I suspect, you're about to see a certain amount of historical tragedy play out on a scale that really very few of us alive have any kind of direct experience with, right? This is in many ways the biggest event of our lifetime. Okay, so don't turn your eyes away from that. It's scary, and you don't want it to be true. And God, one hopes that they will turn aside from this madness, or that it will start to, unfold, and hopefully they will get the message that it's a political nightmare to do something like that, and they will do what every other country in the world, virtually, minus Brazil, has seized on, which is they will decide to flatten or plank the curve through isolation and aggressive testing and tracking and so on. But regardless, what we're living through is a big deal. And so it's going to have these effects. Personally on you, it's going to have effects on all of us, okay? But it's also going to have these collective effects. And part of those collective effects, part of what that's bringing up is precisely this, the archetype of the apocalypse. So we're going to talk about that a bit. But then after, we're going to talk about other kinds of transitions and transformations. We're going to talk about how the addition of chaos in this way can transform and how it's transformed historically. But then we're going to bring it back around. We're going to bring it to Union theory. We're going to talk about the Philosopher's Stone. We're going to talk about the great work, right? We're going to talk about alchemy, and we're going to talk about the self. We're going to tie this back around. So that's the rest of the lecture. This is the preview bit, which I will post up, and then we will talk from there.